The following account happened several years ago in Nepal. I travelled there with my sister Em and two of her friends from high school, V&A. We'd hoped to escape the hustle and bustle of the city life and immerse ourselves in the mystical mountain paradise, to enjoy its culture as well as trek along one of the many Himalayan trails. However, limiting circumstances forced us to go during monsoon season, a combination of increasing heat and humidity that results in almost incessant rains. So, as you can imagine, there was scarcely a tourist to be found, especially on the hiking trek. Dense sopping clouds had snuffed out any meagre light, and milky fog obscured the view more often than not as we trudged along the circuit, but we had a blast nonetheless. The trek itself warrants a telling of its own, albeit a far less serious one, what with V falling victim to a battalion of bloodthirsty leeches lured out by rain, and A getting entangled in escapades, nearly getting knocked out cold from flirting with a farmer's wife. Though battered and bruised, we emerged from the trail victorious, though, and returned to the capital. Our flight back home was due the very next morning, which meant that we only had one day to explore Kathmandu. Kathmandu is quite a polarizing place, with labyrinthian streets and alleyways riddled with kitschy aesthetics and stimuli that push one's senses to their limits. Navigating Kathmandu by yourself, especially at night, is next to impossible, in fact. The heavily polluted air and suffocating traffic doesn't help either, and really, the only one among us who took a liking to the city was V, but she was always big on everything South Asian and was smitten by the various temples. Which is why, with strain leaking from our muscles, our limbs jittering from our 2-week-long odyssey, we were dragged along and subjected to her ministrations on spiritualism and greater meaning and whatnot. But by the time that we staggered out of our final sightseeing destination, the Monkey Temple, it was almost dark. We kept casting apprehensive looks backwards, prepared to fend off the prowling gangs of thieving monkeys skittering in our wake, looking for any opportunity to dispose us of food or the next best thing. One of the little buggers actually took off with my glasses, in fact. As we were descending into the city, having left the temple grounds, our luck got cursedly worse. We heard thunder echoing back on itself in the distance. Clouds, feathery and alive, billowed up at an alarming rate, their colour morphing from shades of purple to jet black, flecked with lightning. It started raining too, and heavy rain that pummeled us as we sought shelter. We splashed through ditches already knee-deep with rainwater and hurtled down alleyways where we hid under a tin roof at the side of the road, our drenched clothing clinging to our skin. Just as we were catching our breaths, a flurry of wet motion appeared in the corner of my eyes. My sister, Em, had darted onto the road and swung her hands upwards. She was always spontaneous and decisive, explosively so in fact, and when she spotted distant white headlights, barely discernible through the downpour, she gambled on it being a taxi, and it paid off. We clambered into the Suzuki with a collective sigh of relief, the prospect of immediate shelter overshadowing the struggle to create space for our bags within the tiny vehicle. It was an impossibly tight fit, but we somehow managed. The scruffy-headed driver, whose calm and deliberate tone of speaking weirded us out a bit, turned around in the near-pitch blackness of the taxi and asked us with a toothy grin where to. We looked at each other in momentary confusion before realizing that we hadn't accommodated this final day spent in Kathmandu into our plan, and because of our unfamiliarity with the city, had no idea what to say. The driver seemed to pick up on this, though, and didn't hesitate to suggest taking us to the Cousins' Hostel, an excellent establishment if he were to be believed. Out of options and utterly exhausted, we just meekly consented. With thinly masked glee in his face, he told us that we'd love it there and that the first round of drinks was on him. Careening through the streets, we tried to respond to the driver's prying small talk, but the hypnotic ding of rainfall on the roof was all it took. As I watched the blur of passing objects and people through the rain-speckled window, like wavy apparitions, I plunged into sleep. When I woke up, we were still in the car and everybody else was asleep, and in spite of the piss-poor visibility and my grogginess, it was evident that we were in a completely different part of the city now. But there was little to no street lighting, and All I could make out were jagged outlines of poles and looming concrete walls and structures. But no people were to be seen, and unease crept up on me. How long had we been driving for? Where exactly was this person taking us? What quelled my suspicion and what made us go along with such a shady plan to begin with was the perceived nature of the people of Nepal. Every single Nepali that we came across was welcoming and kind to a T, which, along with the supposed safety of the country, had lulled us into a false sense of security. It hadn't occurred to us that this fickle trust could be easily exploited. The driver had noticed that I was awake and flashed that toothy grin at me, telling me that it was good timing and to wake the others. When I stepped out of the car onto the muddy, deserted street, I couldn't help but feel the sense of unease sliding through me again. It was a sentiment, too, that was beginning to be shared with the others as we took in this cousin's hostel. We were taken aback, though. Mold-flecked walls with degraded and worn renderings surrounded a house that, despite being camouflaged by the darkness and rain, was unmistakably dilapidated. Granted, it was only marginally worse than the rest of Kathmandu's post-earthquake infrastructure, but it gave off a disconcerting air of ruin. In other words, no way in hell were we about to stay here. At least one of us was preparing to voice disapproval of the entire situation when the driver started bounding around and, in a very animated manner, attempted to usher us through the opened rusted gate into the awaiting yard. We complied, but only to get out of the rain, as it was now flooding over the alleyways created by the narrow lanes of houses and carrying with it its swirling refuse. When we stepped inside, we were met with a carnival of just disgusting imagery, illuminated by a single dim light bulb suspended from tarp that covered most of the yard. Revulsion and dread supplanted whatever unease that we might have harbored, because it was just beyond repulsive. What I can only describe as a sickening miasma covered everything, and it just reeked of foul odor that made my eyes water. The concrete ground was littered with waste, and the walls smudged with caked dirt. The single plastic table was just smeared with who knows what, and I shit you not, there were needles just scattered everywhere. We immediately knew that we needed to get the hell out of there. But it was only when we turned around and looked at the driver under the light that the seriousness of our predicament fully dawned on us. This man looked like diseased roadkill. Sunken, bloodshot eyes stared at us from a face that was just covered with livid sores and scratches. His toothy grin now revealed decayed and cracked teeth, and we were definitely in a drug addict's den. Holy shit, V, I thought. How did you not notice? I mean, you were sitting right next to him. I wasn't sure how to react at this point. He was just standing there, blocking the gate, staring us down. He obviously didn't pose much of a threat. I mean, there were 4 of us against one frail drug addict meth head. Well, 3 of us at least. V's always scared easily, and as I glanced at her, I noticed that she was visibly shaking. She'd be useless should things escalate into a confrontation, verbal or otherwise. A2, for all his loud bravado, he was the first to peel when shit hit the fan. I was starting to get really nervous at this point. I mean, what if he had a weapon on him? A used syringe which he'd lash out at us or something? The last thing I wanted was for one of us to contract something. My mind was racing. How were we going to leave? I was certain that there wasn't a taxi within miles of this deserted hellhole, that's for sure. And where were we to begin with? Our phones were useless without local numbers. I cursed myself for being this obliviously careless. As I was being dissolved by the acids of anxiety, M spoke up. Honestly, she was everything one could possibly want in a leader. Level-headed and perceptive, and she managed to bolster our confidence by taking control. She calmly addressed the driver, trying to explain to him that we'd forgotten to take care of something and that we'd need to rush back to town. We'd pay him double the fare for the trouble, but he wasn't having any of it. With wild gesticulations and an irritated tone, he started speaking rapidly. We barely comprehended him in his frantic state. He was saying that it would be impossible to drive back under these conditions and that our best bet was to just wait it out at the bar. He stressed multiple times that the first round was on him, as if that would entice us. He pointed towards the house, and it's then that we noticed the interior of the house was completely dark. The wide doorless entrance like an ominous invitation into nothingness that lay beyond, threatening to swallow whoever dared to approach. He told us to follow him inside for the drinks and started waving his hand as if time was of the essence. He was starting to rile me up, and I felt like giving him a verbal beatdown, but as if sensing that, Em reacted. She realized how important it was to keep level-headed and told him coolly that we simply had no time, and if he wasn't capable of driving, then he would help us contact another taxi or something. He either didn't understand or willfully ignored her and kept urging us to come inside with him, though. It got to the point that he just kept repeating the same thing over and over, eyes dimmed to a sickly grey and flesh sunk at the side of his mouth. He kept insisting. And if this wasn't all enough, there was a very hostile air about him too. He looked like he was making a concerted effort not to lunge at us, fidgeting with shaking hands. If necessary, I wouldn't have felt bad for a second to topple him like a sack of laundry if he so much as tried anything. V spurted out, very unspiritual like, "Fuck this, let's just leave." At this, he surprisingly went quiet, as if unsure what to do faced with our departure. He turned around and stared at the house and then back at us. He hissed, "Okay, I get phone." With surprising agility, he scurried off towards the entrance too and disappeared into the darkness. We looked at each other and there was a momentary silence, the only sound that of the rain beating against the tarp and lightning booming in the distance. V again says, "Fuck this," traces of panic in her voice this time. She says, "This isn't normal, we need to leave now." I said, "And go where? You saw for yourself that there's not a soul out there and it's raining cats and dogs." Despite trying to be the voice of reason, I knew Em felt the same thing all of us did, a lingering sense of dread that something was just horribly wrong. A was fidgeting too now. Fear had obviously burrowed into his heart, and I too felt afraid. That's when we heard it though, the faint rustling coming from inside the house. Crackling, followed by the unmistakable sound of whispering. My heart was now beating like a drum. I felt jelly-legged and none of us moved a muscle. We were all petrified. The whisperings continued too, and they were just barely discernible through the rain, but loud enough to be picked up. With my eyes trained on the blackness of the entrance, I slowly started inching backwards, and the others followed suit. Just as we were turning around, it happened. The sound of heavy footsteps rushing us, a stampede emanating from within. We bolted, dashing through the gate into the street, and from the corner of my eye, I saw 4 of them mere steps behind us, with another bounding through the house entrance. They started shouting and shrieking at us as we hurtled down the street, sprinting desperately before turning to a side road. One of them threw something at us, in fact, and it fell short and landed with a sickening thud behind me. We ran blindly and turned corner after corner, knowing that a single misstep would kill any of us. V was falling behind us, though, panting like a horse pushed far beyond its limits. Thankfully, the shouting was becoming fainter and fainter, though. We kept running, not daring to catch our breaths or reorientate ourselves, simply following Em's lead through roads and alleyways. At one point, I thought my heart would burst. And just when I was ready to give up, V almost out of sight too, we finally spotted headlights. We must have seemed like lunatics, surrounding the car left and right and center, banging on the windows, screaming for help. It was a miracle the driver, an elderly man, decided to help us at all, in fact. We clambered inside, gasping and heaving, and we wasted no time telling him to hightail it out of there. It took us the better part of an hour to calm down, and V was just hysterical. A's entire frame was trembling, but once this experience infiltrated our minds, we just never felt safe, even when stepping onto the aeroplane out of Nepal the next morning. We decided against going to the police in the end. I mean, we had no evidence, and even if we did, we had no way of finding that house again. Our backpacks were lost, of course. Mam's forethought of keeping our passports in her waistpack spared us much suffering, luckily. To this day, I'm still filled with dread at the thought of that entrance into darkness, with murderers lying in ambush. So this is a story that my mum told me from her childhood. I've put it in my own words, but have not changed any of the details of the events. So here it is. Memories are odd. Every time that you reflect on one, you skew it just a bit, and after years and years, your memories become a disfigured version of what actually happened. It's kind of like that grade school game, telephone, where you whisper something to the person next to you, and then they whisper what they think you said to the person next to them, and so on, and by the time it gets back to you, the phrase being passed around is nothing like the original phrase. I've often wondered how different my childhood was compared to how I remember it. How many details I've changed, how many things I recall that may not have actually happened at all. I fully accept that not everything is as I think it was, and I'm fine with that. One memory, though, haunts me in vivid and precise brushstrokes. Funny how the ones you'd rather forget seem to be the ones that just refuse to relinquish their clarity. The memory I'm referring to takes place in October of 1986, just outside of Dallas, Texas. I still remember the dress I was wearing. It was yellow with white polka dots, long sleeves, and went all the way past my ankles as per my parents' religious requirements. I hated that dress, but at 11, my parents didn't yet think that I was capable of choosing appropriate attire for myself. I hated it because it was rather hard to move in, and my mum had made it herself, and it was pretty tight from mid-thigh down. Anyway, my sister, who was a bit older than me, had just gotten her driver's license, and she wanted to take the car out. My mum said that she could as long as she took me with her. She agreed, grabbed the keys, and off we went. We left around 6-ish, and it was already getting dark, but my sister, who was a little uncomfortable behind the wheel, wanted to drive in the evening so that she would have less traffic to deal with. Well, we also stuck to the side streets and back roads until we worked our way to a stretch of relatively desolate highway. So we'd been driving around just listening to the radio and embracing our first true taste of freedom for about an hour. We were just circling back and forth along some 10 or so miles of the USHW 80 between Mesquite and Forney, Texas, just outside of Dallas. It's a little busier there now, but back then it was just a 10-mile stretch of trees and railroad tracks. It was there that we heard the engine clunk, and my sister's novice driving skills became apparent as the car sputtered a few hundred yards before dying and rolling to a stop. We'd run out of gas, and the closest gas station was a few miles back. This was before cell phones, so the only thing that we could do was grab the gas can from the trunk and walk back to the station. Remember that poorly constructed polka dot dress? Well, this is where that comes into play. After about 100 yards, it was obvious that it would be more trouble than it was worth for me to hobble behind my sister for several miles, so she handed me the keys and told me to just wait in the car. I got back in the car and locked all the doors and just watched the rear window until my sister was out of view. I was a very meek and timid and easily frightened little girl at the time, and it didn't take long for the dark to infiltrate my psyche. But there were no street lights, and I hadn't seen another car since my sister left. But the only light was from the moon, which was full enough that I could see the thick tree line about 30 yards off the road. After what seemed like an eternity alone in the dark, my fear and nerves began to really fray. It was completely silent, and not even the crickets were chirping. I became acutely aware of just how unnervingly silent it was. I wanted it to end, but at the same time was afraid of what might end it. So I just sat petrified, almost anticipating to hear the boogeyman's whispers in the wind at just any moment. All I could think to do was to try and fall asleep, and hopefully by the time that I woke up, my sister would be back. I leaned the seat back and closed my eyes and tried my best to just block the boogeyman from my mind. Another 15 minutes or so passed while I turned this way and that way, just trying to find a halfway comfortable position. It was in the midst of the fidgeting that an eerie feeling just ran down my spine. A feeling that I just wasn't alone, and it was a feeling of unshakable dread that I was being watched. I was lying on my side facing the steering wheel, looking downward at the floorboard, my back to the passenger window, my eyes pressed tightly shut, and I was afraid to open them, afraid of what I couldn't see, of what I might, in fact. I took a deep breath and counted to 3 and opened my eyes, and there was nothing there. I took another deep breath and quickly shifted my gaze to the driver's side window, and I exhaled, seeing nothing there either. You're okay, I told myself. I sat there wide-eyed, just staring straight ahead, focusing on the steering wheel for another 10 minutes or so. And that's when all at once, and all of a sudden, I felt stricken with a paralyzing sense of terror, and the voice in my head just started repeating, "Don't turn around." My heart began racing faster in my chest, and my body stiffened and my limbs felt so heavy as an inner panic had started to take hold. I tried telling myself that it was all just in my head and there was nothing outside of my window, that I was just working myself up. But to my utter horror, however, a shadow shifted off the driver's side seat and then filled it back up again, followed by 3 taps on the glass behind me. That shadow had been covering that seat since before I had even opened my eyes, as I had hardly blinked since opening them. That means that whoever or whatever was outside the car had just been standing there, watching me. As this terrifying thought ran through my head, but there were 3 more taps, louder this time, and I knew that I couldn't just ignore them anymore. I mustered up all the courage that I could and turned to meet the tapper. Hello? I nervously whispered as my eyes tried to focus on the figure outside the window. Aren't you a little young to be out here all alone, little lady? Where are your parents? His voice was deep and had an authoritative tinge to it. As he spoke, chills went down my spine. Suddenly, the air felt cold and the night felt sinister. The man was abnormally tall, the top of the window well below his chest line. His hands were extremely muscular and his fingers long and needly. As my eye tried to focus, he bent his enormous slender frame over enough to peer in the window. He was clean-shaven, revealing extremely sunken cheeks and eye sockets too. His eyes themselves were bulging outward and seemed too large for his face, and while it could have just been the night, I swear that they were completely black. Little girl, he repeated. I asked where your parents are. I'm with my sister, He cut me off and pulled out a flashlight shining into the car. I can't understand you. I'm gonna have to ask you to roll down the window. It's alright, I'm a cop. The ambient light from the flashlight allowed me to see that he was in fact in an officer's uniform, and for a brief moment, relief hit me. Rolling down the window, I spoke a little louder. I'm with my sister and we broke down and she went to get some gas. I couldn't go with her because I can't walk in this dress. A slight grin came across his face. I see. So you're not out here all alone then? He said, almost gleefully. Yes, sir. Just until my sister gets back. And when will she be back then? The closest station is a few miles away. That could take a while, right? My relief was starting to dissipate as the familiar feeling of looming dread returned. I don't know. She's been a couple of hours now, I guess. He said. Tell you what, why don't you come with me and we can go and get your sister? You won't have to walk. How does that sound? It hadn't dawned on me until then, but I suddenly realized that I hadn't seen any headlights in either direction for 20 minutes by this time. I turned to look out the rear window and started to tremble as I confirmed that there was in fact no car in any direction within any eyesight. "But where's your cop car?" I almost hesitantly asked. "Right over there, just through the trees." He pointed to the tree line in the distance. "Haven't you ever wanted to ride in a cop car?" "I think I should just wait here for my sister to get back. She won't be much longer." "Look, it's past curfew, and if you don't get home soon, I'll have to arrest you, okay? Your parents won't like it if you get arrested now, will they?" Now, a new fear entered my 11-year-old brain. The fear that I could be arrested. But my instinct said to not get out. "I'm sorry, sir," I said, rolling up the window. "I really should wait for my sister." As the window was about an inch from closing, he stuck his fingers through trying to stop me, and I ended up smashing them between the door and the glass. He shrieked in pain, pulling his hand back. "Oh, you fucking little bitch! You smashed my fucking fingers!" "Oh, I'm sorry," I said through the now closed window, backing up in my seat as far from the door as I could. He started pulling on the door handle violently and shaking the car back and forth. "Open this fucking door, you little bitch! Do you know how long you'll go to jail for resisting arrest?" He pulled out something that looked like a nightstick and started banging on the roof of the car and the window. He smacked the window again, and a spider web of cracks erupted from where the club struck. Now, I knew that it was only a matter of time before he got in, and was afraid that he'd follow through on the promises of making things worse. I said okay through frantic sobs, not even realizing that I had started crying at this point. He suddenly got completely calm and said, "Well, all right then. Go ahead and step out of the vehicle and follow me to my car." "Yes, sir." I rolled up the window and stepped out of the car. "This way," he said. Tremors ran through my body as I slowly began to follow the man. I knew that something wasn't right, and all I could think was that he was leading me into something unspeakable behind those trees. I wanted to run, but with my dress, I wouldn't make it far before he caught me, and where would I go even if I could? We were about halfway to the tree line, 40 feet away, when headlights lit up the field that we were standing in. "Come on," he snarled, grabbing my arm and pulling me along at a hastened pace. We were 10, maybe 15 feet from the trees when the shouts started. The headlights were now beaming directly on us like spotlights from heaven when several voices, all female, started yelling in our direction. They started yelling, "Get away from that man, little girl. That man's not a police officer. He's a bad man. Let her go, you demon. God is watching you. Little girl, come here to us and get away from the bad man." They just sent a barrage of shouts until the man let go of me and ran into the trees. They yelled to me to run to them as fast as I could, and so I did, as hard as I could, ripping my dress in the process. Two women in thigh-length dresses stood outside the open side doors of an old white church van. They urged me to get in, and I jumped inside into the arms of another woman and heard the door slam behind me. There were 6 ladies altogether inside the van, all older, larger women. "It's all right, sweetie. You're safe now. We won't let the bad man hurt you, okay?" One of them reassured me. I said through tears that I have to wait for my sister, and they reassured me that they'll wait here and keep the bad man away. Every so often, they would start yelling for me to not look out the window and pulled me into their chest to shield my eyes. But curiosity got the better of me, and I peered out against my better judgment, prying my eyes sideways away from the woman who was holding me. And what I saw still haunts my nightmares. It was the man, now completely nude, running down on all fours, in and out of the tree line, and through the field between us too. I don't know what he was doing, but he was moving quickly and kind of in an unnatural way. Sometimes he'd come as close as a few feet from the van and just make the most disturbing guttural grunts and growls that I've ever heard. The ladies tried to distract me by singing nursery rhymes and gospel hymns, and any time he got too close, they would roll down the windows and shout him back. He would disappear and reappear like clockwork until finally my sister appeared, gas can in hand and on the road behind us. I told my sister what had happened, and she said that the worst feeling had come over her and she was running the whole way back. The ladies surrounded us, forming a big circle around the car as my sister filled it with gas. The man was now standing 10 feet outside of the tree line, his clothes back on, watching us the whole time, and he looked and just never spoke as they told him to just leave us alone and not get any closer. When the car finally started, the lady said that they'd follow us to make sure that we'd make it home. We went up about half a mile and made a U-turn to head back, and as we crossed past the place that we'd been stranded, the man was on all fours again, completely nude, sniffing at the pavement where we'd been stranded. The old church van was behind us almost the whole way home, and I never took my eyes off of it. I was afraid that somehow the bad man would get us if they weren't there, but as we turned on our street, I lost sight of them, and they didn't turn in behind us, nor did I see a single vehicle pass on the cross street. Maybe they just turned around and just left, I thought at the time. My mother was waiting out on the front porch for us as we pulled up, and it was obvious that she'd been crying. She said that she'd gotten an awful feeling that something bad had happened and we'd been gone a long time. I told her everything that happened, and she called the police, who came to the house to take a statement. I thought that was the last time that I'd ever hear about that bad man, but unfortunately, a couple of months later, I saw a news story about a girl that had gone missing from a park close to the area where a car had broken down, and witnesses said that the last they saw of her, she was talking to a tall, lanky man in an officer's uniform. Sometimes I think back on that night, and I shiver when I think of that bad man. Other times, though, I think of the ladies in the van and how they showed up just in time and how they just vanished without a trace. I wondered then, and I still wonder now, if maybe I was being protected. I'm not too sure, and I know that whole thing just sounds a little bit crazy, but man, what a weird night.